Hey everybody, Josh from SILCA here with this third episode of the Marginal Gains television series. Welcome back to all of you coming back. Welcome to all of you from the Marginal Gains podcast. We are thrilled to have everybody here, and we're also thrilled this episode to welcome and thank a new sponsor, and that is the Horton Collection. You guys have probably noticed this pretty awesome autographed Eddie Merckx poster in the background. That came to us via the Horton Collection. If you are into vintage cycling, classic cycling, Eddie Merckx, Roger de Vlaeminck, I mean, anything of that era, if it's black and white, beautiful, amazing, no helmets, the blood, sweat, and gears sort of era of our sport, you should really check out the Horton Collection. I'm a huge fan of both that era, but also of what they have really curated and they're putting out. Just amazing, beautiful imagery. So please check them out. Thanks to the Horton Collection, our new Marginal Gains TV sponsor. So I am super excited for this third episode, which is on our topic of nonlinearity. So nonlinearity, as we've talked in prior episodes, is one of the factors to a truly effective marginal gain, right? Because our brains tend to think and operate very linearly. We tend to make assumptions that things will behave linearly, and when they do not, that can often be quite challenging. So the person, the company, the system who's willing to really dive in and attack the nonlinear problems quite often finds that there's a lot of advantage to be had because most people just aren't willing to go there to really take these things on. These are complicated, hairy problems. Okay, so nonlinearity is why aerodynamics are so important in cycling. To start us off with that, right? So we know weight's important, rolling resistance is important, all these things are important. But if you really want to go fast, here comes aerodynamics and this whole power drag relationship that really smacks you upside the head, probably somewhere in the mid 20-something mile an hour range. And as you push up and up, you get into that nonlinear part of the curve where things get really ugly. So what is nonlinearity? Well, let's put some graphics up. So this is a line. And I think, as you probably have guessed by now, line is linear, hence, the words. So a line is linear. It can be up, it can be down, it can be flat. This is linear behavior, right? You move a little bit one way, a little bit the other way. We talk about weight, right? We move a little bit up, a little bit down, pretty standard. Let's get into second order, okay? This is a second order curve. You see it's a pretty different behavior. Now, how big a behavior can second order be or affect? Let's think about it in these terms, and let's also play with our brains a little bit so our brains can experience the sort of pain and suffering of nonlinearity. So I don't play golf, but my father-in-law, huge player, big fan of the game, and to demonstrate nonlinearity, I once asked him, I said, hey, I bet you $2 on the first hole, and we're going to double that bet on each hole afterwards. Okay, so we're going to play 18 holes, $2 bet on the first hole, $4 bet on the second hole, $8 bet on the third hole. What are we playing for on the 18th hole? Now, if you're like me, this feels, and I deal in nonlinearities every day, this feels like a relatively linear problem. But let's think that through. I'll give you a second here. Jeopardy music, please. Oh, wait, we don't have licensing for Jeopardy music. Okay. Awkward pause. Okay. We're back. The answer, if you haven't come up with it by now, 2 to the 18th power, you can do it on a calculator. If you turn your iPhone from portrait to landscape, it becomes a little scientific calculator. You can go 2, x to the y, 18, enter, and you will get a little over $262,000. Okay, that's a bit of a gulp. That is nonlinearity in play. it feels linear in the area that we're looking at, right? Even any one of the hole-to-hole differences along the way, because it's just doubling, feels linear. But you get to that 18th hole, you're at $262,000. If you're playing a tournament-level 36-hole game, okay? So we understand the nonlinearity out to here, $262,000. Let's double that to 36 holes. And think about that number for a second, and that number works out to be, about $68 billion. That is the power of nonlinearity. We use this example in the podcast, and Hadi pointed out, quite sadly, now I understand how hedge funds work. This is the power of these compounding percentages and gains. This is a second-order equation. The other one I like to use, one of the nearest and dearest topics to my heart, truly, pizza. Huge fan. We have a restaurant here in town that we absolutely love whenever we do special events for the company. Here at SILCA, I always go and get pizza from there because they do a 22-inch pizza. 22 inches, think about that. So, standard large pizza, 14 inches. A standard extra large pizza, 16 inches. How much more pizza is a 16-inch pizza than a 14-inch pizza? Right? Now, you know I'm tricking you here, right? Because this feels like, it's 2 more inches. That's like, what, 10%? It's a little over 30% more pizza, right? So I think it shows because you've got that whole, radius squared thing that goes on with the circle. So it's like 31% more pizza from a 14 to a 16. From a 16 to a 22, let's think about that. It's about 2.5 times more pizza. 2.5 times. You think about that. It's just, the math works. It's beautiful mathematics right there in front of you. It's undeniable. But even knowing it, it is really hard for your brain to kind of see the scaling there, because this is nonlinear. This is area. It's where we struggle. You take that into a cube, right, to cubics, right? So I've got x, y, and now I'm going to go cubic this way, and our brains even further struggle to understand it. And like I said, I deal with this stuff every single day, and I still get caught out once in a while with some of my, kind of the quick assumptions of how things work. So that's a great starting point to help you. Oh, and we didn't put it up, but this is what a cube, just a simple cubic curve looks like on a thing. You can see how much steeper it gets, right? That's very clear. Well, we've, of all the possible exponents, we've gotten to 3. And, you can pretty much put any number up there, so you can imagine how extreme some of these curves and relationships can get. I think my favorite example, other than the ones we've just used here, to really think about is transistors in computers, right? So you think of a microchip, what they call a logic engine. It's essentially, printed with in sort of an XY grid. I'm sure we can find a picture that we can put up. There it is. Those are transistors on a microchip. And you think back in the 60s, Gordon Moore came up with his law that, was it every 18 months we double the transistors on a microchip. And one of the things that really works in the favor there is what happens when you're trying to make things a little bit smaller. If you can make a single transistor a little bit smaller in both Y and X, then that cascades out, right? And they all fit a little bit more densely. And you keep going. If you look back 60 years of transistor development, they've become something like over 1 billion times more dense than they were. This year, 2020, we will produce something like 5 times more transistors in the world than there are grains of rice and wheat and other edible grains combined on the planet. Is a crazy fact I heard the other day. As I was getting ready for this, I read it and went, wow, more transistors made than grains of rice. Unbelievable. But it just keeps getting denser and denser. And the beauty of that with trying to miniaturize something when it's effective, now that those transistors are closer and closer together, there's less distance for the electrons to travel between them. And so you actually gain electrical efficiency with this. So if I take the other side of that, a true physics marginal gains problem would be a jet engine, right? And from the same time period in the 60s to today, jet engines have only increased in efficiency about 3 times. And we're pretty maximized out relative to the math in terms of just what's going to be possible. We know we are sort of in the flattening of the curve, what we call the asymptotic region of the curve, when it comes to jet engine efficiency because of the thermodynamics of the problem. And if you're an engineer and you did thermodynamics in college, you just fell asleep on me. So I feel like I need to make a loud noise to wake you up. Everyone else, don't worry about it. It's a challenging topic. Bear with me. So let's get into something more interesting, and that is aerodynamics in cycling and kind of how these nonlinearities affect us. Now, we all feel this when we ride every time, right? I mean, this is why it's easy to go from 10 to 15 miles an hour. It's pretty easy to then go from 15 to 20. From 20 to 25 gets pretty challenging, and if you really want to go 30, that's a different story, right? These are very nonlinear relationships, and the thing that really burns us as athletes in the nonlinearities here is that the aerodynamic drag is related to the square of velocity. Okay, so as velocity doubles, the aerodynamic drag goes up by 4 times, right, because of this square relationship. Unfortunately, and I hate to say this, but you already know it, the power to overcome the drag goes up at the cube of the speed. And so we double the speed, we quadruple the drag, and we have to now make 8 times more power. 8. Yeah. So let's put this into some terms that we can all sort of get our heads around. I can go 20 miles an hour on my road bike in a pretty standard road position on about 180 watts. And I think now that we all have power meters, or we're Zwifting, riding the kicker, whatever that is, what 180 watts is, and that's pretty manageable. You can do that for a while. Let's say 20, 180, that's not bad. I'm going to go 25. That's like 325 watts on that same position. Okay, so if I'm not starting to really kind of hunker down, 325 in that same position. If I want to go 30 with that same riding position, I need to make about 540 watts, right? 540. I think we all know that with my fitness, that is not going to happen. So this is why we naturally, as athletes, and I think this is pretty cool, we naturally understand some of this, right? Which is that as you're on the bike and you're going harder, you find yourself coming down in position, kind of naturally taking on that more aerodynamic position. Partly because you're struggling and you feel like you can make a little more power, low, nose of the saddle. Partly because, we've all seen it on TV and we know that's what you're supposed to do. But I think partly you can feel it, sense it, and hear it in your ears, the wind. You can feel the wind against you as the speed comes up. Your body naturally wants to come down to get out of it. And I think it's an interesting effect that we do this on motorcycles as well, right? We're not the ones exerting ourselves, putting out that much exertion to make power on a motorcycle, but you still find yourself as the speed goes up, you naturally come forward to try to shelter yourself from the wind. So this is the relationship that we are fighting. This is also, I think, in some sad way, the reason that so many people for so long said that aero didn't matter until you got to 30 or until you got to 25 or until you got to 20. I've heard all of these. And the reality is aero matters everywhere all the time. It just matters more as you get faster. So, the things that you do to improve aero drag and to go faster, at 30 are still helping you at 25 and 20 and 15, just with a diminishing rate of returns there. But the good news is they're never hurting you. So, you go buy those, you wear a skin suit, you buy those Aerodynamic socks, a nice set of Aero wheels. They're always working in your favor, just sometimes maybe less so than at others. One of my favorite ways of slicing and dicing in cycling terms, the aero drag and sort of the importance of the non-linearity of aero, is looking at our record in time trial. And I think those of you who've heard me speak, listened to the podcast, you know my obsession with these events. Where the speeds are higher, these minute aero details can make huge, huge differences. And so we will kind of close the non-linearity episode before we really get into the deep, deep aero stuff with one of my all-time favorites, the 1989 Le Mans Fignon time trial at the Tour de France. So if you don't know it, you got to look it up on YouTube. It's phenomenal. Le Mans comes into the final stage of the Tour, a 20-kilometer time trial. He's 50 seconds down on Fignon, and he decides to ride the Scott aero bars, which had existed for a little while. The folks at Scott, and actually a friend of mine who worked with 3T, who was doing the production at the time, had been trying to get the riders to ride them, and nobody wanted to ride them because they thought they looked a little bit silly. But Le Mans was desperate, 50 seconds down. He decides to ride the aero bars. And in 20 kilometers, he puts 58 seconds into Fignon. 58, yeah, in 20K, right? That at the pro level, that kind of doesn't happen at the top anymore, but he's able to do it. Essentially, it's an asymmetric warfare situation, right? He was able to pull a tool out of the shed, develop the aero position on the bike, and have in that moment an extreme advantage over Fignon. Interestingly, had Fignon made some other choices, he probably wouldn't have lost. So Fignon went helmetless on that day, despite having a very good aero helmet he could have gone with. He's quite famous for having this very long, flappy ponytail, which I have oft been quoted as calling the 8-second ponytail, which it probably was more like 10 or 12, if we're going to be honest. But not having the aero bars killed him. If we put this into modern cycling terms, and this is the one that I have used forever, I brought a prop with me here. This is a favorite Dixon Ticonderoga No. 2 pencil. If we were to put Le Mans' win into real-world terms, the 8 seconds over 20K is what you would essentially lose if you had this pencil sticking out on your bicycle at those speeds. So one way to think of this is, this is the same diameter, give or take, as cable housing. So that much less cable housing could have been the difference, right? The ponytail could have been the difference. I mean, there's a million little things. At these levels, even the most marginal of marginal gains can actually be big factors in the outcome of an event. I think for the rest of the race or an event, the marginal gains really, in a lot of cases, are us playing around with the statistics, kind of in the edges, increasing the likelihood of winning. We'll get to that a little bit further in our Moneyball episode, where we talk about Team CSC being the first ever team in pro cycling to really sort of play the Moneyball game. If you're familiar with that book and movie, if not, check it out before you watch that episode. It'll give you some good context. So there you have it. We've got the third, installment now of marginal gains. We've introduced asymmetry, non-linearities. These are words that we are going to need as we really get into some of the topics at a deep and interesting level. Our next episode is going to be called hysteresis. It's not related to hysterical. It's something totally different. It's a fascinating, interesting topic.